Well, we will begin. So let's open up with prayer. Lord, just pray that you would be with us tonight, that we would learn valuable things, and that we would learn valuable lessons as we study this history. In Jesus' name, amen. So we've been in the age of the Reformation for a while, but a lot of different things are happening at different times. And so the way this particular class works is we're just kind of focusing on the events. So we haven't just entered into the age of the Reformation, but we've kind of been in here for a little while. And in this chapter, we begin to realize how denominations came to be. Because for so long, early on, the church said there can only be one thing. There can only be this one organization, this one manifestation of the church, and we have to strive to make sure everyone believes the same thing. We need to have these councils and preserve it. We need to have the government come behind us and enforce it. And so for a long time, it was just the one thing. But in this chapter, we realize how the denominations came to be. Ultimately, they came into existence because people were finally given the freedom to differ. They didn't really have that freedom before. Before, they just had to believe what their government and the one and only church said they had to believe. And so the process was slow at first. Since the formalizing of the Catholic Church, the unity of church and government were unquestioned. You had a king, you had a pope, they were in unity with one another. And early believers could not fathom the concept of a church that wasn't also one with the ruling authority. So when they thought about the church, they thought about the government. They were tied together. You know, how else would the church maintain unity, harmony, singularity of mission if they didn't have civil law helping to enforce it? And even in our modern world, one of the most common complaints about the church is the lack of unity. It's like, how come there are so many different churches? How come we all can't get along? And from the 4th century to the 18th century, this concept of freedom, tolerance, and division was kind of unthinkable. There were some small steps. There used to only be the Catholic Church. Eventually, there was the Catholic Church and the Lutheran Church. And in the events of this chapter, we'll see a more formal establishing of the third group. The Reformed Church came on the scene. And they were slowly coming on the scene, different groups, different expressions of doctrinal belief. But they all continued to embrace the idea, even as these groups spun off. Martin Luther came and started the Lutherans, and under the influence of John Calvin, the Reformers came along. Even as they were doing something different, they still, in the beginning, carried with them this idea that they need to be united with civil government. So where the Protestant Lutheran Church was established, they had a Protestant Lutheran king, and they were in unity with one another. And so they all continued to embrace that idea that civil government and church should be one. And so if you are a citizen of a certain government, then you must also be a Christian under that government's belief. You have the benefit of thinking differently, but that all depends on what nation you live in. So the past 300 to 400 years have contributed much to our current mentality, but it's helpful in extending understanding to those believers who try to see things as they did. You know, we can't easily dismiss them for believing wrong things or different things than one another. Many people excelled in devotion and sacrifice and academic study. Even if we can go back and say, oh, your polity was wrong, your government was wrong, your doctrine was wrong, we can still go back and say, well, look at the devotion, look at the sacrifice, look at the academic study. You know, the church was still excelling in so many areas in ways that our modern church is completely devoid of. Their oversweeping intent was to combat the criticisms that draw so much sympathy today. Why is a church which is intended to be unified so divided? And the answer to the question is simple. There's a few answers, but answer number one, it's divided because we are free. We are free as individuals to read and to learn and to be led as the Holy Spirit leads us. So because there is freedom, there's going to be differences. It's divided because we have removed the power of compulsion from government. We no longer have a government saying, it is the law, you must believe things the way we say you must believe things. And it's divided, honestly, before government and church worked so hard to enforce the one denomination system. Before that, it was divided. Early on, even in the New Testament, the church was divided. The church was pure on Pentecost, Acts chapter 2. Peter preached, all these people got saved, and for a moment there was unity and purity in the church. But things began to break down after that, and Paul's like, now I have to write a bunch of letters, because people are starting to get some crazy ideas. Conflict and division entered the church moments later as people began to integrate some of their own thoughts. The reality is, even when every citizen was forced into a common denomination, when every citizen was forced to be baptized and to practice a compulsory religion, they still weren't unified. Some believed, and some simply went through the motions because the law demanded it. Many were not believers. They were just doing what their government expected them to do. And here's something we learn in history, not just church history, in world history, that when a government demands tenets of faith upon its citizens, 4 possible things will happen. So if our government came and said, everyone must be Presbyterian, it's the law. And so we're like, okay, I guess we'll have to be Presbyterians. 4 things will happen. Most will just blindly comply and believe in a surfacey, nominal fashion. They'll go through the motions, they'll say the right things. Some will become truly zealous for that religion. Some people are just very susceptible to cultural pressure, and so a lot of people are like, this is what my government's doing, this is what my culture's doing. They're going to be very zealous. Some will not believe at all, but out of fear and necessity, they'll comply. They'll say the things, they'll do the things. And fourth, some will discover faults in the faith, and they'll have the boldness to believe, embrace, and preach something else. There will always be people who rebel if they are forced to believe something they don't believe. So when the religion law is opposed, the outcome has and always will be persecution and violence. That's what happens. When government says you must believe this way and people don't, the government responds, the church responds with persecution and violence. We still have one major religion in the world that is operating under this mentality, this system of government and state unity. And as a result, in many of those places, this is Islam, of course, in many of those places, there is no legal tolerance for other beliefs. In some places there are, but in many of these countries there's not. To believe something else, to break the rules would lead to fines, imprisonment, torture, and in some countries, death. So for many seasons in history, the church has kind of shared this same mentality, and they too have practiced these things. And they've done it for the exact same reason that the Taliban or Al-Qaeda or ISIS does it now. They want everyone to comply to a common belief. So for a time in history, when the church and the state were united as one, we had the Catholics under their king, we had the Lutherans under their king, the Reformers eventually got someone to lead for them, and they treated those who broke the rules in the same way, by fining them, imprisoning them, and in some cases, even killing them. Even one of the groups that came to America, the Puritans, who formed their own colony, formed their own company, they enforced very similar rules upon their people. So humans can, have, and always will find ways to distort truth. But truth is still truth, and unless we're given the freedom to differ on it, we won't have the freedom to discover it. And so the big question is, why are there so many denominations? Why can't we get along? Why can't we all just agree to do one thing? Because we are free. That's why. So the events in the next chapter are of great importance in our history. There will be more violence as these ideas are birthed, but very soon the seeds of independence among the believers will sprout and they'll take root. But in the beginning, the nonconformists are speaking up and they're trying to suppress the nonconformists. The demands of state religion led to many bloody conflicts. War, and eventually, after some time of war, the two sides would make some concessions. There was the Peace of Augsburg, which established an agreement to divide and coexist as neighbors under separate rulers. So you had this big section of Europe. There would be an emperor over it, but it had many, many states. Within those states, you had princes. Those princes could decide, our state's going to be Lutheran, or our state's going to be Reformed, or our state's going to be Catholic. So this thing, I think it was in 1555, this decision that was made at Augsburg offered that. But this agreement failed to address the growing reform movement was struggling to find sponsorship. And so they're like, no princes want to lead any states under the reform flag. So they were kind of on the outs. People could choose to leave the rule of one leader. It's like, well, our prince is Catholic, but we're Lutheran. They could leave. They could move from one state to the other. But the reform movement was without a government, and they were not willing to comply. So eventually, there was unrest again. And we get what is known in history as the 30-Year War. And it was from 1618 to 1648. It started out as a church thing. It became political in the end. But war broke out in Central Europe. It had everything to do with the division between the Catholics and the Protestant states. And for 30 years, 8 million people died. There was starvation, there was famine. This was a big deal. There was an emperor named Ferdinand II. And he came in and he commanded all of the citizens of the empire, of every state, of every prince of every state, who had already been given freedom under Augsburg to have their own, say whether they be Catholic or Lutheran. After that, he came in and said, no, everybody now has to be Roman Catholic. And this was in spite of the freedom the citizens were given with the Peace of Augsburg. So the Peace of Augsburg allowed princes to adopt within their realm to either be Protestant or Catholic. So now all of the Lutherans are upset. The Reformed people are already upset because they don't have a home. And war broke out. And the war raged on for 30 years. And when it was all said and done, the Catholic emperor, Ferdinand II, didn't gain a common united state to rule, but actually ended up with a country that was divided into 300 individual states. It was fractured even more than it was before. So in the end, they agreed that individual princes could decide individually what state religion to enforce, which had already been established in 1555. So some of the same problems continued, but the Reformed Church was now added into the mix, and another step was taken towards denominationalism. Around this time, if you looked at the dates, 1500s, 1600s, we know in that time period things were happening in America. What was happening in America? Well, people were moving to America. And lots of people were moving to America simply because they didn't want to comply to what the church in England or the church in whatever country they were in was forcing them to comply to. And so, but England did not enforce a state religion in the new colonies. They were just happy to have people there to work. So for them, the settlements in America were more about business, were more about economy, and they were happy to have different groups coming to America because those groups provided labor. Now this slide gives us a breakdown on kind of where some of the denominations in America came from and where they settled. But one group defied this ideology, and they attempted to create a unique state with a unique religion. So the Puritans in New England were united in faith and identity. And to take it a step further, they established a company which was completely independent of England. That was the Massachusetts Bay Company. And in their midst, they demanded the same kind of beliefs and devotion as their predecessors, even dished out harsh punishments upon those who disobeyed. In fact, many of these rules were established through all of the Americas early on for quite some time before a lot of these denominations began to break off and have freedom. In fact, this isn't in our notes or in our study, but the very first place to actually have a free church that didn't demand all these rules was in Rhode Island. A guy who was once a Quaker, broke away from it, moved to Rhode Island, and started a church. He called it a Baptist church, and they were the first church that actually was free. People were not being policed on whether if they were living moral lives and if they were following the rules and they were doing all these things. But denominationalism essentially sprung out of the disdain for sectarianism, the idea of the church not being represented as one single ecclesiastical structure led to more and more independent thought amongst the believers, and led us into what is called the Age of Reason and Revival. And we start talking about guys like George Whitefield and John Wesley, familiar names in terms of revival. Things really began to change for the church about 1648 to about 1789. We begin to see some more familiar names popping up, names which have much to do with modern thought, names that have to do with science, things that those who have helped to shape Christianity in our times began to appear. And so we're going to see guys who are coming and bringing revival, but we're seeing other people who are bringing different forms of thought, and that wasn't always good. Sometimes they would bring forms of thought that would help the church. Sometimes they would bring forms of thought that would actually oppose the church. And we're going to see both of these groups, and so we enter into the Age of Reason. This time period is also called the Age of Enlightenment, which the onset of individual thought within the church began to rise up. People began to think for themselves. And it came the onset of individual thought, not only in the church, but outside of the church. The Age of Reason gave rise to many of the mentalities that led to a strong belief in a secular life. Because before this, no one really thought in terms of living a secular life. Everything was, there was pressure to be part of a church. As before, men's main concern was the afterlife, and therefore they emphasized faith. Now they're placing more emphasis on reason and now, because their concern was focused on how can we have happiness now. And this kind of goes hand in hand with the time that we know as being the Renaissance. The word Renaissance also simply means awakening. People began to respond to their impressions of religion with reason. They began to push back. The first to do this was a guy named Erasmus of Rotterdam, who responded to Luther's views on free will. Luther had views on free will because of free will, we had the freedom by grace to receive salvation and to become saved. So Luther emphasized the doctrine of man's inability to love and serve God apart from his grace. Erasmus focused on man's reasonable will to choose what was or was not his moral responsibility. In addition to the writings of Erasmus, kind of public opinion towards the church began to turn. And this was new, because before this, everyone went to church. Now, under this new way of thinking, a lot of people are like, yeah, we don't think we're going to go to church because we are thinking differently about life. All of the past wars and the violent methods of the church began to wear upon the moral fiber of the people. They're like, we're in this church, but look at all of the bad things the church has done. And so people began to kind of feel disdain for it. Advancements in science began to challenge and correct the ways that people thought. Copernicus insisted that the sun was the center of the universe, whereas before that, everyone's like, no, the earth is the center of the universe. Kepler and Galileo, I can't say his name, made even more discoveries about the way planets moved and about the acceleration of the stars. This was all new information. These discoveries were yet to be framed in an all-embracing principle that would explain how everything worked according to common law, and began to push against not so much doctrine in the church but certain traditions the church had adopted concerning these things. The task fell upon Newton, who discovered and explained the law of gravitation. And Newton was a believer. He was a solid believer. Newton introduced ideas that challenged the thoughts and perspectives of people, and the climate within the church began to change. So not only did we have these thinkers drawing people into secularism, but we also had these thinkers coming into the church, like Newton, encouraging them to think differently about the world around them. There was much debate between human reason and faith. The writings of a guy named John Locke, he wrote on this topic widely, and people, he was read widely. People began to really embrace his ideas all the more, and he began to influence the church. Many philosophers began to rise up and speak openly against the Bible. This was a new thing. The parts that could be confirmed by reason were extolled. They would open their Bibles and they say, oh, look, by reason this makes sense. By reason this makes sense. And they liked those things. But things that were not reasonable were kind of written out and they were criticized. Kind of like the Thomas Jefferson Bible. That was his view on things. Take out all the miraculous, save all the things in there that are reasonable. The parts that require faith, the supernatural parts, the spiritual parts were dismissed. There was a group in France called the Philosophes, not philosophers. They were called the Philosophes. It's probably because they're French, and it was some kind of weird French word. But they focused on the evils of the world. They analyzed the evils of the world, and they would advocate reforms upon those evils in the world. And these guys didn't regard themselves as atheists. They said, we believe that there is a God, so they were deists. One of the most famous guys who was part of this group was a guy named Voltaire. He was one of the most famed people from this group. And he declared liberty and freedom of the press. He spread what was called in society the cult of reason. He opposed organized religion, but he himself had a high regard for the teachings of Jesus. His group declared the supremacy of science. They championed tolerance. They denounced superstition, and they expounded the merits of deism. So we begin to see the influence of the church kind of fading away and the influence of these new thinkers coming on the scene. So unbelievers were challenged about their beliefs. They would say that if the church was responsible for killing people in the name of the church, then the church was evil. That was their claim. If the church did evil things, then the church was evil. They considered the church from the perspective of human reason and from a judgment standpoint of good and bad. Not whether people were being misled, not whether people were walking in disobedience, not whether people were following false doctrines and acting accordingly, but the church is the church, and the church did evil things, therefore the church is evil. They rationalized anything miraculous. They criticized belief in miracles, and the church had to react to the words and the writings of these people who are known as deists. The Roman Catholic Church attempted to, but their attempts were poor since they were out of touch with what was really going on. They were just trying to argue on the basis of their traditions. Well, this is what our traditions say. This is what our doctrines say. And these philosophers and these deists were like, we don't care about any of that. None of that proves anything to us because we don't believe that stuff. A guy named Joseph Butler back in England did a better job responding to the deists. His monumental work was called The Analogy of Religion. And this is what they would do. There would be criticisms and complaints, and then people would respond by writing a book or writing a series of letters. He provided answers to the deists without denying sound doctrine. And even though Butler brought reasonable answers to the age of reason, it was the deists themselves who brought an end to their movement. Their answers didn't satisfy. They were like, these are the things we believe in. What do you believe in? We don't believe in anything really, just some principles. And after a time, they became disinterested in what they believed because there was no hope in it. But Christianity didn't really rebound. Christianity was kind of on the decline in this time period. Modern culture was officially freed from formal Christian influence. and man sought to make a religiously neutral society. Meanwhile, back in the Catholic Church, the Jesuits were making far too much of human reason. Now, these guys started out being, really serious about doctrine and really serious about compliance. But over time, they began to be the ones who kind of took on a more liberal doctrinal view. And they were coming up with ways and reasons to forgive men's sins and justify them. Basically, what we see back then is that the Jesuits were very lenient doctrinally. The writings of a guy named Cornelius Jansen were speaking out. Were speaking out against the liberal views of the Jesuits. And he inspired other Catholics to then begin to oppose the Jesuits. And this led to the rise of a movement called Jansenism, after this guy's name. He was probably thinking he wished he had a cooler name. Now there was a movement called Jansenism. And they held to kind of Augustinian views on sin and grace. They sought to establish a moral code for clergy so that they could combat these liberal views that were infiltrating the church. The cause was carried on by a guy named Antoine Arnauld II. Arnauld attacked the Jesuits and got some pushback from the Pope. He said, "You guys are wrong, you guys are bad, these are the things that you're doing." The Pope pushed back at him. He continued to come against the Jesuit movement, and he recruited a guy, we've heard of him, his name is Blaise Pascal. So Blaise Pascal met this Arnauld guy through his sister. He embraced the ideas of Jansenism. Blaise was also influenced by two physicians who attended to the illness of his father, and both of them were Jansenites. And he took great interest in the teachings of this guy and committed a lot of time in Bible study. But after his father died, those two doctors left, and then his sister moved away. He just kind of fell away from it, and Blaise Pascal turned to a life of extravagance. And in that life, he found no satisfaction. He was discouraged. And so eventually he returned to his faith. But in this time period, he was known for writing 18 letters against the leniency of the Jesuits. He also began to write on the proofs of Christianity, but he died before finishing those writings. And after his death, those writings were found, and they were published under the title Thoughts, the Soul Returns to Life. So we begin to see some scholasticism rising up amongst the Protestants, because the Catholics kind of owned the universities, they owned the schools, but now the Protestants are starting to get established. They're uniting with some different leaders. They're getting some influence in different parts of the known world, and so they're establishing formal education. They're establishing confidence in reason and religious controversy, and so they began to develop the Protestant doctrine and to formalize it. The reformers, who insisted on biblical reliance only, they kind of opposed these methods because they're like, we should just have the Bible. But some of these Protestants are saying, I know, but we can really supplement and we can really support what we believe about the Bible if we study these other areas, if we study science and philosophy, because this was the age of reason. And, they were trying to accomplish reason and support the church at the same time. And the church said, no, it just needs to be the Bible. We're not going to look into any of these other things. And so the church responded by saying, we are going to dedicate ourselves to piety. And they emphasized the individual faith and fellowship with the living God. And so this was a huge breakaway from what a lot of the church was doing. This was a big breakaway from the Catholic Church. This was a big breakaway from a lot of the Protestant churches too, because they were saying, we don't need you. Our faith is an individual thing. We can become believers without the church. And so they emphasized individual faith and fellowship with God. They emphasized personal faith, and they left behind the Catholics, and they left behind the Puritans. And they believed that Christianity started with the individual. And they sought to kind of shift the center of the Christian life from the state churches to the intimate fellowships where people with real living faith gathered. And so these people would probably be called the first house church movement, and they weren't really committed to that, but that's where it began. They called their movement, their pietism, they called it the soul's return to life. And in the late 1600s, a man named Philip Spencer began to preach in Frankfurt, and he preached from the whole Bible. He had his Bible, and he was preaching from every book in the Bible. He emphasized repentance, and he emphasized discipleship, things which we're familiar with, but that was revolutionary back then. In 1669, after preaching a message on the Sermon on the Mount, people began to respond. This was a new thing, preaching and people responding to preaching. You probably haven't seen this since, the New Testament church. Families began to be transformed. After this, Spencer began to gather believers in his home to discuss the Bible. People began to mockingly call this group pious. And from here, the Pietist movement was born. And they spread by an associate of Spencer, a guy named Hermann Francke. And Francke was a university professor, and he used his university as a hub for his ministry. And so under this new movement, this new group, this new denomination, we could call them, this guy established a school for the poor, an orphanage. They built a hospital. They established a Latin school. They built a house to put widows in, a house for unmarried women, a medical dispensary, and a place for people to get books, and a printing establishment. All of these things came out of this new church movement. So now it just wasn't just the church. Now the church was establishing all of these ministries to reach out into their community. Pietism was later dominated by a man named Count von Zinzendorf. Zinzendorf became a significant leader in a church called the Moravians, or the Brethren. And he had a great heart for missions, and as a result, the Moravians became the first large-scale Protestant missionary force in history. And we're going to see that they're going to have an influence on a significant person in history who had a significant influence in both England and America. Pietism had a huge impact upon the ongoing reform of the church. They focused on the regeneration of the individual. They said that if you have a doctrine that gives you no experience, then your doctrine is empty. Their efforts and experiences led to many of the modern revivals that we're going to talk about in a minute. They encouraged real fellowship with one another. They had intimate gatherings of believers, and they established many ministries. And they were a big part of what would be the evangelical awakening. So in Western Christianity, the Age of Reason led to a spiritual renewal called the Evangelical Awakening. And this started in Germany with the Pietists, in Britain with the Methodists, and originally the Methodists were just a part within the Church of England. So the Methodists didn't become their own denomination for a while. They just started out as a group within the Church of England. And in the American colonies, we had this thing called the Great Awakening. So John Wesley was on his way, but he had many forerunners in the awakening. Jonathan Edwards, a guy named Ebenezer and Ralph Erskine, they were brothers. Howell Harris, George Whitefield, and John Wesley. So a lot of these names we recognize, and some of these names we don't. We've heard of Jonathan Edwards because everyone's heard of his sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. We've heard of John Wesley because he founded the Wesleyans. And so John Wesley, here's a little account of his conversion. He said, "In the evening, I went very unwillingly to a society in Aldersgate Street where one was reading Luther's preface to the Epistle of Romans. About 9:15, while he was describing the change which God works in the heart through faith in Christ, I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ, Christ alone, for salvation, and an assurance was given to me that he had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death. So John and his brother Charles were the sons of a minister in England, which means they grew up in the Church of England. John's mother was the daughter of a minister. They were born into a heritage of the Church of England. John studied at Christ Church in Lincoln College. He was impressed with early church fathers and was devoted to the classics. His readings convinced him that he could not be half a Christian. He had to be all in. John was ordained in the Anglican Church. He spent 2 years working under his father. After some time, he returned to Oxford, where his brother had organized a gathering of students, and these students were like, we're really serious about our faith. And under John, this group followed a plan of study and a rule of life and a life of prayer. They're like, what do we do? Well, let's establish a rule of life. So this is what we're going to do, Basically, it was all methodically laid out. A plan of study, a rule of life, a life of prayer. And so people began to make fun of them because they had this method that they were following, and they began to call them Methodists. So Methodists started with a college group of people who were just really devoted, and they were following a methodical system to really devote themselves to. John was invited to go minister in Georgia, our Georgia. So he came over on a boat, and John Wesley had a terrible experience. The whole thing was a failure. If people later on in his life say, tell me about Georgia, he'd be like, I don't want to talk about that. I'm embarrassed about that. It was a bad time. He conflicted with the Native Americans. He conflicted with the white colonists. They resented the way he was. He's wanted to kind of present this rigid, methodical, practice of faith, and no one liked it. While he was there, he fell in love with this girl named Sophie. And he thought, well, maybe it's not all bad. Here's this girl, I'm really fond of her. And then she eloped with his rival, another missionary who was there working in America. So, what did John do? I don't think he had the authority to do this, but he banned her from Holy Communion. He showed her. Her husband sued John for defaming her character. There was a trial. The trial dragged on for 6 months. This guy was supposed to be a missionary. And this is what he was doing. And so he finally fled home. So this is the great John Wesley. Came to Georgia and was a big loser. But he returned home reflecting upon the faith of, he met these people during his journey. He met the Moravians. And he thought their faith was pretty incredible. And that really began to change him and influence him. So he sought them out when he got home. Like, those people had real faith. I failed as a missionary, but man, during my time, I met them. Their faith was real. So he returned home and he started looking for them, looking for the Pietists, the Brethren, the Moravians, all the same group. And it was around this time period, while listening to a preacher teach on Romans, that he had an amazing and moving experience with the Lord. And from that point, everything changed. His preaching became zealous. He wasn't seeing much change in people. He read the reports of God's work from Edwards in America. He was inspired by that. Jonathan Edwards is preaching in America, and people are getting saved. And here I am preaching. I'm very passionate. I'm not seeing it happen. Weeks later, he came in contact with a guy named George Whitefield, who had just returned to England. And Whitefield wasn't satisfied with the preaching opportunities that were being offered to him. He's like, he said, I've been preaching. People have been coming, listen, people have been responding. I want to preach. And they just really weren't giving him any opportunities. So he said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to do something that no one's probably done since, Jesus did it. But I'm going to find a field and I'm going to preach there. And it was, again, revolutionary. And so he began to preach in fields, and coal miners who didn't go to church began to come and hear his preaching. And there was quickly a great revival amongst the miners. And so Whitefield, had gotten to know Wesley, and he said, "Why don't you come and help me?" And Wesley was reluctant because, he was not as gifted of a speaker as Whitefield was. And he's like, "How could I do what you do? I'm not as good as you." And anyway, have you heard about my story in Georgia? I'm a total loser. But, he did it. And when a crowd of 3,000 people stood before him in a field hearing his preaching, and many of them responded, he was blown away. He was just like, wow, the Lord is really actually working through me. And the Methodist revival in England was officially underway. So God had worked in John's heart, and he went out with new zeal to preach, and he went wherever people would listen. John Wesley was wherever people would listen, he would preach. He preached in jails. He preached as he was traveling to people who were in the inns. He would be on a ship going to Ireland. There were reports of him preaching to people getting saved on the ship to Ireland. In Cornwall, there was this natural amphitheater, and he was preaching there, and there are reports that 30,000 people came to hear him preach. When he was refused admission at Epworth Church, which is the church where, he served at one point. His father was the pastor there. He went out in the courtyard of the church, and he stood up on his father's tombstone, and he preached to those who were gathered. He traveled nonstop, mostly on horseback. He learned how to read, how to study, and how to prepare sermons on the back of a horse, and he was very organized. He established Methodist societies wherever he went. These were still groups within the Anglican Church. He encouraged these groups to gather regularly for prayer and study. He encouraged them to continue in their membership with the Anglican Church. But the Methodist societies were additional groups of people who were serious believers from within the Anglican Church, and they were committed to the Word and to fellowship. Wesley was influenced by a guy named Jacobus Arminius, who was a Dutch professor, he was a Dutch professor, but he was also a student of Calvin, but he disagreed with Calvin on a few points. And so he put together, here's my views on these things. And then Calvin responded to Jacobus Arminius, by saying, well, here's my response to you. And that's where the 5 points of Calvinism came from, what we call tulip. But Jacob developed a modified version of Calvinism, and his dispute was simply with the way predestination was defined by Calvin. Wesley stressed a view that is defined in Jacobus Arminius' view, which held to the teaching that man has the will to choose whether he will or will not receive the salvation God offers him, where John Calvin said, if you truly are the elect, it will be irresistible. You will choose. Your will has nothing to do with it. And the doctrinal teaching led to a conflict between him and Whitefield. These guys were partners, but now we have the first conflict between the Calvinists and the non-Calvinists. And they went different ways. So John's brother Charles began to travel with him and served as the worship leader in their time of singing. So we know about Charles Wesley because, y'all have probably sung his songs before. They say he wrote up to 7,000 hymns and songs. I mean, I can't fathom that. In fact, I thought this must be a typo. And so I had to do a little reading, and I'm like, well, I found other sources that said very similar numbers. I thought, surely it's 700. No, it's 7,000. His Methodist societies began to grow in numbers, but he felt like they were most effective if they remained small. So he said these groups need to stay at groups of 12, and he appointed many assistants and teachers to help manage the ministry. And when the organization grew too large to allow him real contact with everyone, he said, well, we're going to have now an annual conference. And everyone came together for this. And they would shape policy, doctrine, and the vision of the Methodist movement, which was still part of the Church of England. By 1748, the Methodists were like a church within a church. For the next 40 years, Wesley resisted the pressure from his own group. They're like, we just need to become our own denomination. And he resisted that for a long time. Years later, the Methodist Church in America, they said, we're just going to become, we're not into England anymore. And so they became their own denomination in America. They were independent, and Wesley gave in, and the Methodist Church in America was organized under its leadership there, and eventually the Methodist Church in England followed suit and became their new denomination. The deist founders of the American government showed us that they have been strongly influenced by Christian heritage. The seal of the U.S. had many biblical concepts proposed, but this is what they settled on. One out of many, God has smiled on our undertakings. 1776, a new order for the ages. And these words were timely, for the church in America was also becoming a new order for the ages. The order that was to be established in the American churches is quite different than the one that they had elsewhere. Like, why did America become what it was? Because people wanted independence. People wanted to fight against oppression. People wanted to do their own thing. They wanted freedom. They wanted something new. They wanted something different. And that spirit was also evident in the church in America. The Americans were not joining themselves with any one denomination. No one was telling them they had to, and they weren't about to be told. They weren't unifying everyone under one covering and then providing support. The churches in America were determined to make it on their own. It was going to be the volunteerism of the members that made it happen. So this level of independence, once again, revolutionary. But it provided the opportunity for individual fellowships in America to get together, to study their Bibles, to grow together in doctrine as God revealed himself to them, instead of forcing membership and then teaching those memberships the church's sacraments. The church in America decided that they wouldn't accept members unless those members first accepted the gospel. And so they were doing things different. You want to be a member of the church? Well, you must first become a Christian. Before that, people were told they were a member of the church, and then they had to learn how to become a Christian. So there was one group of holdouts of the old way of doing church. And so we mentioned them earlier. The Puritans held to the union of civil government and church. And it took them some time, but they too eventually followed in this tradition. The Puritans resisted the Great Awakening that was happening all around them. You know, people were just coming to fields and to churches and to different locations and hearing preaching and getting saved and getting involved in local churches. And the Puritans were worried that, well, if we're going to be part of this, we want people to get saved and come to our church. I remember many, many years ago when we started our church, and we wanted to do an outreach in our community, and we reserved the band shell downtown back before it was what it is now. And we had some bands coming in, we had a speaker coming in, and our goal was just to declare the gospel to our community. And so I thought, being young and idealistic and dumb, that I could actually go and talk to some other pastors about getting involved. And so I'd say, we want to do this event, we already have it rolling, we'd love to see other churches come and be involved. And our goal here is not to promote our church or anything like that. Our goal here is to have the gospel preached in our community. And I got the same answer more than once. Well, if people get saved, how are we going to divvy up these new believers? Who gets them? And I was like, I am baffled. I don't even know how to answer that question. I was like, I don't even know what you're talking about. It was kind of disheartening, but this is the mentality, that so many people have. And the Puritans were like that. They were very resistant to what was happening during the Great Awakening because, they were worried that other churches were growing and other churches were getting people, and all of those other churches were wrong, and they wanted control. But eventually they gave in, They couldn't deny what was happening around them. The Puritan view of the church, they said it was founded upon grace, but their methods didn't always show it. They demanded proof of conversion of potential church members. They demanded proof that the person was living a moral lifestyle. And so they wanted a list, Are you moral? Yes. Well, these are the things you need to prove to us. And sometimes these inquiries were quite stringent. Puritans controlled those who could vote by requiring them to be church members. We've all visited places that had they put people in stocks. I think they had them in Jamestown. You can go and you put your hands and your head in there. The Puritans loved that thing. Because if you didn't come to church, they would come find you and put you in that. Put a sign out front, didn't go to church. They managed a person's morality before that. They'd let that person vote. You cannot even vote in our elections, in our community, until you align with us and believe what we believe and become as moral as we are. And over time, they created kind of a light version of church membership. They call it the halfway covenant. The heirs of Puritanism eventually went two ways. Some followed the preaching of Jonathan Edwards. They kind of moved away from it and responded to the personal call of conversion. And others, these ones called the halfway believers, continued on in their civil and social ways without much attention to true spirituality. But the Great Awakening was going on. The Great Awakening had a huge influence upon America. It had a huge influence upon American government also. This was probably the first time that we really saw Christian groups gathering together and bringing up people that they wanted to elect and getting their people voted in. We kind of saw that come out of the Great Awakening. According to George Whitefield, the beginner of the Great Word was, the beginner of this whole movement was a guy named Theodore Frelinghuysen. Probably said that totally wrong. But he was a Dutch Reformed pastor in New Jersey. Whitefield's like, it wasn't me, it wasn't Wesley, it was this guy. And from there, the Scottish-Irish Presbyterian experienced the work of the awakening. And in a school in Pennsylvania, a guy named William Telmet was discipling and sending out preachers with evangelistic zeal. And as more of these guys were preaching, there grew a division. A big church that was part of the Great Awakening was the Presbyterian Church. And so this guy was just like, I have a little Bible school. Come, I'll teach you some basics. We'll send you out to preach. And so in the Presbyterian Church, they were like, oh no, we have people who are going out who are unschooled, and we have people who are going out who are schooled, and that's wrong. We need all our preachers to be schooled. And these little schools that this guy named William Tenement's doing, they're wrong, they're bad. And the church literally split over that. But the preaching continued. The side of uneducated preachers sent out missionaries to the South. Revival came through these groups to our state, Virginia. The Baptists also began to spread the gospel throughout Virginia and North Carolina. In New England, Jonathan Edwards was leading a fellowship in a town called Northampton. And in 1734, conviction fell upon that city. And it says that everyone in that city had great concern for their souls. In 1739, Whitefield came to the Americas and he preached up and down the East Coast. He was invited to Boston to come speak at a very large venue, and this kind of set a precedence. From then on, if a renowned preacher came to town, they would always be invited to large cities to preach in large venues. So that whole idea started with George Whitefield. He left for England. In his absence, the preachers of the Great Awakening began to draw big crowds of people, and people were falling under great conviction. So great changes were happening. The Awakening brought changes to America, had a strong influence upon a guy named Isaac Backus. He ended up forming a Baptist church in England. He formed a committee to ensure the freedom of religion in Americas. He believed that all connection between state and institutionalized religion must be broken. In 1740 through 1742, the Great Awakening had brought, they've estimated between 25 to 50, it's kind of a big span of numbers, but I guess they didn't have people counting back then. But 25 to 50,000 new believers in New England alone. From 1750 to 1760, 150 new churches were established, and these only represent a small percentage of what happened all up and down the East Coast. So there was a big shift in how the government was being structured back over in England, back over in France, basically. And in France, these changes in government meant changes for the church. So amazing things were happening in America. Back over in France, changes were happening there. And much of this section focuses on political issues in France and how they infected the church. But they're the beginning of the events that will bring about the end of what is called the Papal States. When everything was said and done, the power of the church over property it once ruled and government it once extorted with excommunication and threats would be gone. Because we saw that some popes would do that. We talked about that a few studies ago. That if somebody wasn't complying, they would extort them with threats of saying, you no longer can take communion until you comply and do this. And so, fear of their souls, they would then comply and so forth. In France, the ruling class and the church leadership was kind of a small percentage of the wealth, and the higher majority of the citizens lived in poverty and were kind of coming to terms with the fact that they were powerless. So you have this mass group of people who felt powerless because they were poor, and this dissatisfaction ultimately led to the events of the French Revolution. The revolution went hand in hand with the Age of Reason, kind of same time period, which brought a more liberal influence to both the culture and the church in France. And so Napoleon comes on the scene. Napoleon defeats the monarchy. The church that went hand in hand with the monarchy lost its prominent position. The National Assembly wanted to reform the church in France, and so they imposed a loyalty upon the clergy, and they said, if you still want to be clergy, you have to do things the way we say to do it. And if you do that, then we'll pay your salary. And so they eliminated all control of the Pope over anything in the French church. But they also began to secularize the country. Anything Christian was removed from the calendar, and many of these churches became temples of reason because they really weren't truly dedicated to the gospel. And so this caused a massive split amongst the believers in the church. And, 30 to 40,000 priests went into hiding because, they didn't want to toe the party line of the government. In 1794, France guaranteed the free exercise of any religion. So they're like, you don't have to do it our way. You can come practice religion as you want. And with this, the exiled priests came back. But liberal thought at this point had become so widespread in France, in an area that was once ruled by the Roman Empire. After Napoleon was overthrown, the new monarchy tried to bring it back to the old ways, but the people weren't having it. The people didn't want to go back to the old ways. Public support and sentiment for the old way of thinking just wasn't there anymore. There was especially a strong uprising of discontentment, not only in France, but over in Italy. There was a public disdain for the Papal States and the Pope right there in their own country. And as a result, the Pope, who still had some loyalty with some French people, surrounded himself right there in Rome with French soldiers. The liberal reformers originally liked the Pope, a guy named Pope Pius IX, but after revolutionaries killed the Papal State Prime Minister, the Pope had to flee. And he wasn't too willing to be cooperative upon his return. And under the leadership of King Emmanuel II, the Papal States fell and all of Italy came under one rule. So now Italy wasn't being ruled by the Pope anymore either. The Pope was still protected by the French army, but France was having a war. So they're all like, well, sorry, we have to go to our country and fight our war. So now the Pope is unprotected. And so Emmanuel's like, oh, we're going to get this guy. He's causing problems for us. Let's go get this Pope. So they rushed in, but the Pope locked himself in the Vatican, declared himself a prisoner. And in 1929, a treaty was reached And so they said, you know what? You can still have your papal state. And you can still have sovereignty over your nation. And then this is how and when the Vatican state was established. The whole Italian government says, we don't want to be ruled by you anymore. The Pope said, I still want to rule. So they made a deal. Okay, you can have the sovereign state of the Vatican, which is why to this day the Vatican is considered its own country. So the section ends with the process where the church officially would decree the Pope infallible, which basically means papal infallibility is a dogma of the Catholic Church. It states that in virtue of the promise of Jesus to Peter, the Pope is preserved from the possibility of error when, in the exercise of his office as a shepherd and teacher of all Christians, in virtue of his supreme apostolic authority, he defines a doctrine concerning faith or morals to be held by the whole church. This was a belief that they had, but they formalized this doctrine around this time period after the Vatican had become a papal state. And that's where we're going to end tonight. So lots going on in the world of the church in America, in France, and in Italy mostly. But we see huge transitions, huge changes in this time period. So, any thoughts? Charles, you usually have something to say. Nothing? All right.
I just appreciate the last slide having the word ultramontanism.
Ultramontanism? How'd you pronounce it? Probably better than me.
I said ultramontanism.
I like it.
I can't really read it.
Yeah, you're a long ways away. Lord, thank you again for giving us the opportunity to come together and to study and to learn. And I just thank you for our fellowship. In Jesus' name, amen.